So, any questions before we start? Or any thoughts or wonderings or?
Yeah, well, I struggle with some of those parables.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
Some?
Yeah.
Try preaching on these things.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
Matthew 10, there were some things there, and yeah, I was just like, wow, what does that mean?
What does it mean? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, that's the job of your preacher, is to sort it out, going back to the original language and sorting it out for you.
Okay.
Because trying to do it yourself is just kind of confusing, and your brains will just
Mhm.
kind of go like that. Yeah.
Mhm.
But yeah, if there's anyone in particular, we can talk about it. Matthew 10, you're wondering about?
Well, that's I'll I'll write you a note.
Yeah, write me a note, and
Yeah.
I'll do a little study for you
Okay.
in my free time. Anything else on your mind? Yeah,
I
John.
think this is for, I'm behind the
Oh, okay,
reading, but
that's okay.
in the Corinthians, it made it seem as if the early the worship services of the early Christians
Mm-hmm.
they kind of remind me of a Quaker meeting, that Paul admonishes them, if you're speaking in tongues and someone needs to
Right.
prophesy, you step back and let him prophesy, and then you can speak in tongues. It's all about prophesying and speaking in tongues, neither of which we really have in our services. So it must have been very different, but I'm just curious about it.
Well, all I could say is that those were old spiritual gifts. They weren't new to Christianity. They were common in Judaism, speaking in tongues. But then Paul later on, remember, goes on to say, don't let these spiritual gifts make any sort of hierarchy, like, oh, you're more special than me because you speak in tongues. He abolished that. But as you notice, Paul goes back and forth between what he wants to be and what he is. And it's almost like when he says, I do those things I do not want to do, and those things I should do, I don't do. He's aware of his going back and forth about um, how to live a transformed life when he's an older man. He's stuck in his ways. Am I making some sense? So he kind of goes back and forth, and you'll see that in the letters. I hope that helps. Okay. Anything else?
In Mark, they have two endings.
See, we talked a little bit about the ending of Mark, right?
Yes.
The first ending is where the women fled from the tomb and kept everything secret.
And that was it.
And that was it. That was the ending of Mark. But since then, over the centuries, they've added extra endings because they couldn't make sense of how the gospel could have been spread. So it's called,
They and when?
good question. The canonical writers in the 4th century.
Oh, so it's a good bit later.
Way later.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's almost like this book shouldn't, I mean, I dare say this. At first the Bible was not allowed to be read by anyone but scholars and clergy. And then with the Gutenberg Bible, it became widespread. Excuse me. And everybody could read it. But in a way, that's a disservice because it doesn't make a lot of sense without the background. Does that make sense to you?
I think the thing to remember about the letters also is, if you think about it, he was writing to people in these areas that he had preached to. And it's sort of like writing letters. If you're writing to a different friend, you communicate to them differently based on your experience with them.
That's interesting. If they're in conflict or they're
at
different cities.
Correct. But it's like if you were writing to friends, you would communicate to different friends differently based on your experience with them.
That's true too. Yeah. Well, shall we jump in?
Sure.
Okay. We're going to start with John. Piece of cake, right? Am I in your way? Can you see this?
It's fine.
I can't see anything.
Can't see anything. You can't?
No,
No.
close enough.
Now I
Oh, there
can.
you go. Okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Kate put the thing on, the point PowerPoint. So
Yeah. Okay. So the Gospel of John was written in 90 AD by an author unknown. It's interesting, it doesn't tell us a whole lot about what Jesus actually said, the way that Matthew and Mark did. But it tells us a lot about how Jesus was spoken of by this point in time. It's very different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are called synoptic, which means same. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are much alike, but John is very different. But it has shaped our understanding of Jesus more than any of the other Gospels.
Why was it called John if they didn't know who wrote it?
Well, I don't know. I don't know.
Oh, okay, I just, Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
And these names came in the 2nd century,
Mm.
where they way later said, let's call it the Gospel of John.
Okay.
All right, there were a few themes in the Gospel of John. One, as we know, is the Word made flesh, which has become bedrock in our doctrine. The great I am statements. Have you heard of the great I am statements?
No.
You'll find it throughout John's Gospel. Whenever you see the words I am, in Greek it's ego eimi, and it's of special significance. The great I am is God. The great I am is God. And in John's Gospel, he has these I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I am the light of the world. I am the gate and the door. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. These things that we've heard a million times, these are I am statements. Super significant.
I think Yahweh is I am, isn't it?
It's another form for God, another word for God, Yahweh.
Okay.
Mhm. Matthew and Mark have none of these statements. Is that interesting? As opposed to Matthew and Mark, who teach in long parables, John teaches in long discourses, just a long sort of essay sort of thing. John's gospel spans 3 to 4 years, whereas you might remember Matthew and Mark's only spans 1 year. In Matthew and Mark, there's only one Passover. In John's, there's 3 to 4. John's gospel really emphasizes Jesus' divinity versus his humanity. And you'll find differences in, if you read through it, you'll find differences in the timing of things. Like, remember the parable or the story of him throwing the money changers out of the temple?
Mm-hmm.
In John's gospel, this happens way early on, right after the wedding at Cana. Whereas in the other gospels, it happens the last week of his life, and it was the tipping point for his crucifixion. And I don't know what to say about that, other than.
And that was many years later
Mhm.
that was recollected.
Yes, through many
So it might
forms
not
of
be,
oral tradition and,
right.
yeah. There's a difference with Jesus and Pilate. In Matthew and Mark, he's silent. He says nothing. Whereas in John's gospel, he almost bests Pilate. And you'll read that when you'll see that when you read it. There's even a difference in the day of crucifixion. In John's gospel, it happens the day before Passover, whereas in Matthew and Mark, it happens on the day of Passover. Hi there.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
I'm sorry, I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
Just started.
Oh. Well, both ways.
Yeah, come, can you see?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
how farsighted. See, I told you I was gonna forget it. Man, I'm a man of my word.
Good job. Good to be consistent. All righty, so we're down to here, talking about the differences between John and Matthew and Mark. John's gospel, you may even think of it this way without maybe even having words for it. John's gospel is called the spiritual gospel. Jesus he uses much more symbolic language rather than historical type of literal language. So although it's less historical, maybe because it's so much farther
Later.
out,
Right.
it gives us a real view of how Christians view Jesus and what has shaped Christianity ever since. It's almost in recollecting Jesus and getting to know the whole story of his resurrection and ascension and his presence with us, signs of his presence. We know that he was the Messiah. We know he was all these things, but the writers who wrote closer to the event didn't have that big rear view summary. Okay, so this is John's gospel. You'll find some phrases that you'll recognize that have become hymns and that sort of thing. It's really shaped our religion. Any questions about John? Oh, there's more. I thought that was awful short. John speaks of eternal life 17 times, but remember we talked a little bit about the difference between the afterlife and the transformation of this life. And that's what he was referring to, although he also speaks with great confidence that death is definitely not the end. But the transformation of life and eternal life was meant to be here and now, the way we live together and take care of each other. John talks a lot about the lordship of God versus the lordship of the world. And Paul talks about that too. I will mark some passages for you. Chapter 17, verse 3. I wanted you to read what John says about this. He says this. I've got it for you. Just listen. And this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. So that implies current. We may know you now. Does that make sense? A little bit? Some furrowed brows?
Or is that an understanding?
Is there a difference?
I'm not sure.
Good question.
It's just like an axiom.
That's a good word. I don't know what that means.
It's there's no disputing it.
Yeah. Now you'll see in John, here we come to the hard part. John's gospel is even more condemning than Matthew's against the Jews. In chapter 8:44, let's see if I can put this in context. Oh, it's so harsh. You, meaning the Jews, are from your father the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. It goes on and on and on. It's very, very harsh, and it's very, very dangerous, especially when taken out of historical context.
Wasn't he really talking about the leaders though, and not?
That's really, yes. When he speaks of the Jews, what we need to
Oh,
know is he's
okay.
speaking of the authorities. Well
Right.
done.
Right.
So remember the Jewish Christians' persecution of the non-Christian Jews. Remember that, and the parting of the ways. this all gave more fuel to the fires of anti-Semitism and Jewish persecution. Isn't that something? All that said, even though he speaks the most condemning language towards the Jewish authorities, he speaks to our deepest yearnings, and he closes with the imperative to follow me, meaning Jesus, of course. Rough stuff, I know. How do we make it right? Alrighty, moving on to Ephesians. Often attributed to Paul, right? But not written by Paul, written in the year 90. It's a general letter written to the churches. And what I gather is it's much like when the diocese, the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland, sends out a big email to all the churches. And sometimes they get posted on the church's website and people can read. But it's a general letter to all the churches. This is some hopeful news. Talks about a reconciling, that there is unity of Christian Jews and Christian Gentiles, at least, not non-Christian Jews and Christian Jews, but a unity of Christians, whether they started out as Jews or Gentiles, and that they are one body. There's oneness in them. That in Ephesians we get the beautiful passage of put on the armor, the whole armor of God. Do you remember that in Ephesians 6? The helmet of truth and the shoes of the gospel, and it's very
I'm just stopped at, I think it was Matthew, where they talked about Christ telling the apostles, only go to the Jews,
yes,
do not go to the Gentiles.
exactly.
I thought that was, wow.
Right,
Yeah,
right. I know. And it was only the post-resurrection Jesus at his right before he ascended, when he said, "Go to all the nations." After, I think a lot changed on Holy Saturday. I believe that's when hell was vanquished. I believe that's when Jesus shifted into his full divinity again and changed his message. It's big. But there's some bad news that the household codes were getting even more strict than the Colossians. So they were, although the community was growing and getting more solid, they were starting to bend again towards the hierarchies of the Roman Empire and the old ways of subordination and obedience. But they were trying to be faithful. Have you heard of the phrase Pauline tradition or Johannine tradition?
Yeah.
Meaning, like, let's say the communities that John founded, they were called Johannine. It's just a word for John's. And Pauline, those were communities that Paul founded. So the Pauline tradition, they were trying hard to live into Paul's tradition, but of course he was a little inconsistent, wasn't he? Any questions about Ephesians? We'll roll on to the simple book of Revelation. So this was also written in the 90s by a different John altogether, John of Patmos. Patmos is an island in the Aegean Sea. And John was a very common name, as was Jude, you'll see later. There was John the Baptist, John the disciple, John the brother of James, all sorts of Johns. And this is John of Patmos. He was an Aramaic, his primary language was Aramaic, Palestinian Jew. He did know Greek, but because his Greek was a little rough, they were able to discern that his original language was Aramaic. He was a Christian missionary and what we call a religious ecstatic. So a lot like the ones who speak in tongues, but these are the ones that see visions. And I joked with my daughter, she laughed so loudly. I said, I have one theory about Revelation, and it's one word. And she said, what is it? And I said, mushrooms. We don't know what he ingested before he. I'm so sorry, I shouldn't say that, we're friends. You know, whether, we don't, there's all sorts of theories about visions, whether it's a form of a brain seizure or an actual religious experience, or whether there's mushrooms. We don't know. But basically, there's a vision, and then letters, and then lots of visions, and then a conclusion. So try to go through it just knowing that that's the shape of it. It's not endless. It's a little hard to read. It's quite violent. This was written to second and third generation Christians to the 7 cities in Asia Minor. You'll see the number 7 many, many, many times throughout John's rather Revelation to John of Patmos. These visions were all about the second coming of Christ and that it was imminent. Again, not something that is imminent for us, but something that was imminent for him in the 90s. Again, it's often misunderstood to refer to our time. Are you all familiar with the Left Behind series of novels?
No.
They're called Left Behind is their title. I think there's probably 7 of them, I'm guessing. And they all talk about the rapture and the second coming of Christ, and who is taken, who's left behind, and all sorts of culture around Revelation talking about right now. This is all going to happen right now, but this is what was thought to happen in the 90s. What he's describing is called the Great Apocalypse, which was not unusual in Judaic culture. They had apocalypses often. So basically, the structure of each vision was a vision of this world versus a blessed world through the intervention of God. So always looking for a better world to come.
Going back to the apocalypse
Mhm.
for a minute, I mean, that could be something as common as an eclipse or a volcano
Could be.
erupting,
Could be,
or
yeah.
so more natural type versus the Roman army coming through and wiping everybody out.
Right, all the above, you know. And the word apocalypse means revelation, means to be something to be revealed. Yeah. Let's see. Can you see if I'm leaning like this?
Oh, no
You're good?
problem.
Okay. The violence in this writing has given the world a lot of justification for being violent themselves. Kind of like, well, if God, and the violence is done by God in this book. The thinking is that people would think if God can do it, then I'm justified to do it too. So a dangerous book, really. Again, I mentioned the structure was a vision, letter, and more visions, and then the conclusion. But here's some helpful information. How to interpret the book of Revelation. You'll see references to the dragon, the beast, Babylon, the great whore, all these awful terms. They're all referring to the Roman Empire. So keep that in mind when you're reading it and kind of translate as you go. It'll make more sense. The number 666, we're familiar with that being a dangerous number. That was apparently something, I don't know enough about this, but a numerical code for Emperor Nero.
A funny little story here,
Oh, yeah.
real quick.
Uh-huh.
My business, I had a phone number,
Oh, no.
410-666-3800.
Uh-huh.
And I had a customer once, and we were a national small business, and he called and he said, "I will never do business with you."
Oof.
Because you got that phone.
Right.
Wow.
Wow,
Yeah,
Right, yeah.
I wouldn't buy a house that had that address or,
right.
I know.
Superstition. And
Yeah,
then there's some people that'll do things that are 13.
just for that reason.
Yeah, just for that
uh-huh,
reason.
Yeah, yeah. Emperor Nero being the first persecutor of Christians, so he's considered this number. It's a book full of warning, and it's a book full of yearning for a better age to come. Any thoughts or questions about Revelation? Anything on your minds? Okay. I never forget I got into such trouble from a former supervisor. I used to call it Revelations.
Oh.
And oh my gosh, she just laid me out. It's not the Revelation, it's the Revelation to John. Okay. Sorry. The book of Revelation to John of Patmos. All right, moving on. We're going to be done early today. Okay, so you have more time to chat or read or whatever you'd like to do. But we're moving through our class pretty quickly. We may be done before the December date with Professor Deirdre. So if we are, I'm going to ask in advance with her. If it looks that way, I'll see if she can move up her visit
One
with
week.
us. Otherwise, we'll just gather on December 14th.
You said we weren't gonna be here, well, obviously for Thanksgiving.
Right, and the week after too.
And the week after,
Mhm.
okay.
All right, here we
Couldn't
go.
remember which week.
Yeah, that's okay. So, Jude, another very, very common name. A lot of people thought this was Jesus's younger brother. But of course, it was written in the year 100, so he'd
He
been
couldn't
pretty
be a
old.
younger brother.
He'd still be pretty old if he had written this. At this point, in whichever community he was in, I don't know, it had been invaded by what they called intruders who denied Jesus's, how do I put this? They were antinomialists, which meant they felt that because of Jesus's grace, it didn't matter what we did. We just do anything because Jesus' grace was that great. And they were considered intruders and invaders because of that belief, that they didn't feel they needed to transform their lives. They could just do whatever they wanted, and still get to go home to God. Which actually, that's a whole other conversation, never mind. We'll find in the very last book of the New Testament, in 2 Peter, that it's much like this, which means this was still going on at the end of the first or second century. Some distinctions in Jude, I'm not sure you'll be able to tell, but this is the only New Testament writing that uses non-biblical Jewish sources, like the book of Enoch and the other one. But they're not canonical Torah. And of all the New Testaments, the most condemning of all. Luckily, it's short. Now we come to 3 very short letters: 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. All written in the 2nd century. 1st John is written in about year 100. Author is unknown, but did live in a Johannine community. In fact, all these 3 letters and the Gospel of John were thought to be written by around the same Johannine community. We don't know if these were written by the same author. My hunch is that these 2 were definitely not, and I'll get to that. Again, the community was divided and in conflict. Churches have had a hard time from the get-go. Just couldn't quite get it right. And these folks, the ones that were dividing them, were called Docetists. Does anyone know that word, Docetism? Docetism was the belief that Jesus was not actually fully human, that he was actually partly divine. And that's why he could live like he did, and love like he did, and die like he did. But it denies his incarnation, and it denies his oneness with us. Does that make sense?
Why do they try to make those
They just couldn't believe.
separate?
I don't
That he was a
know.
real person.
They needed to believe that he was partly divine. That just didn't make sense to them. That he could have done all that and been fully human.
Now, were these more Jewish people,
I don't
or were
know.
these more,
Or Gentile?
yeah,
I don't know. Good question. Yeah. Yeah. These are things we don't often dig into and think about. But as you grow in your learning and in your formation, you'll be asking bigger questions. That's a good thing. I think God loves that. Loves us for our questions. I think blind obedience is the last thing God wants. That's just my opinion. I think that's why we're given free will, so that we can choose to love God. It's not automatic. But that's a different sermon. Alrighty, so that's the folks that were intruding and messing up the community here, the Docetism. Now these last two letters, 2nd and 3rd John, the second one for sure was written by a woman Christian leader to another woman Christian leader, which is lovely to think, to have evidence of women's leadership in the early church. It's written from the elder to something like the great lady, and it closes, well, you'll read it when you see it, but by a woman to a woman. And the two themes were to love one another and to be aware and wary of deceivers. Again, it's not long after 1st John was written with the Docetists in there. 3rd John is also written by the elder, which is the same way this one opens. And that was, I'm pretty sure, a woman, unless there was another person who called themselves the elder. Written to Gaius, whoever Gaius was, another leader of a community. These are both very short, 13 and 15 verses. And this one emphasizes hospitality to strangers, commends one group for their hospitality and condemns another for their lack of hospitality. So that is all I have for today.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Would the Catholic Bible be identical?
No, because the Apocrypha is part of their canon.
Oh.
Yeah. Good question.
And these Jewish sources in Jude, would they be, if we had a Jewish Bible,
Mm-hmm.
would they be in there, or are they
No, that's
extra?
just it. They're not in the canon.
Okay.
Yeah. Kind of in their Apocrypha.
So everybody picks and chooses, I guess.
In the 4th century, they decided what belonged in the Bible and what didn't. And what didn't make the cut is also very interesting.
I think that about women, the Catholic Church,
Yeah, that wouldn't,
it wouldn't fit in
that
there.
wouldn't fly.
Can
Okay.
you do a session sometime later on in the Old Testament? Can we?
It's so oof.
I
Well,
I feel like I don't really understand the Old Testament. I know it's so long.
Look at the difference.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say no.
Part of it,
Yeah.
maybe a part of it, start out with a part.
Yeah, not this before December, but maybe let's schedule something, another.
I wish I was
A
enough of
year
a
long
scholar
thing.
to do that for
Yeah,
you.
okay.
That
I
is
focused
huge.
on the New Testament, but
Well, and that's the part with Jesus.
that's right.
That makes more
This all
sense.
prophesied Jesus.
Right.
And then
This-
then
Then
you
we
showed
get
up.
into it.
That's right.
Yeah.
should think it would be a real challenge to try to figure out the chronological order of
Right.
the Old Testament.
Oh,
Oh,
God.
God.
I have to get my Old Testament professor to come teach us.
Yeah.
Or you need to go to seminary. But thank you for asking. I'm gathering this has been helpful.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. What other thoughts or questions? Anybody?
I don't know enough to ask a good question.
Oh, I got that.
That's all right, you can ask a dumb question.
You all ask really good questions. You keep me on my toes.
Well, maybe that explains why there's so much hate,
Mm,
you know, that these people wrote these things condemning, say, the Jews,
yeah,
and we can't get over that.
I know.
And it's just, I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense,
Mhm,
you know, because they're just people like we are,
yeah,
you know, and I have good friends that are Jewish, and
mhm. Yeah,
it's just you have a different belief, and who cares?
and I guess maybe the more literally you take the Bible,
Uh-huh.
the more it lends itself to persecution and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's, I've been enlightened with, is that it was all written in context of the times and where they lived.
Right.
Right.
And I guess we were taught that the early on that the word was infallible,
Exactly.
but
It's not.
it
It was
is.
human
it is
beings who
fallible.
wrote it.
Yeah.
Human beings wrote it, and we,
You can't take it literally, right?
well, I think about my cousins talking about stories about I have a cousin who's about 9 years older. We talk about stories that we each heard about our grandmother.
Hmm.
They're different,
Hmm.
and they're different recollections.
So interesting.
And
yeah.
so, and, you know, and we were alive with her. It wasn't like we
Right.
did it after she died. It was when we were alive with her that our stories were even different. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, it shows you that if people are writing this, you gotta take it with a grain of salt.
And nothing was written
And it's a guide,
until way after many versions of
Right.
an oral transmission,
right?
like that elephant
Chain,
game,
telephone,
game,
where you say something to someone, and they say it to the next
and it
person,
gets all
and it's all
messed
screwed up.
Yeah. I was gonna say
And songs, think about songs that were passed down, say in Appalachia, you know, songs that became famous songs.
Mhm.
They're different versions of them.
True.
So how can you, you know, you can,
You can't take it literally.
no, you
Right.
can use the premise. And, but, you know, you can't go, this is it.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, it's odd that the Pharisees and the leaders got in trouble because they took everything so literally.
Right.
And Jesus came and said, you know, you can't do that, you're wrong. You know,
Right, you
you're
have to have
getting it
heart.
wrong, you're getting
Right.
the message wrong. And yet, you know, a lot of evangelicals or everything take it so literally, you know.
Yeah,
It's interesting.
And generations before, where it was never mentioned to them that it was not written by God. Kate has a great story. Kate, I'm gonna share your story. She found a Bible and she loved it so much she bought it as her very own. And she loved it because on the very first page, it said written by God.
oh.
And I just love that, but we grew up thinking that,
Yes,
Yeah.
right?
we were taught that, yeah.
One of the things I was so appreciative of at my priestly ordination was the vows we had to take. It did not say that we believe the Holy Scriptures were written by God. We believe the Holy Scriptures are inspired by God, divinely inspired, and I do believe that, and lots of humanity in here, with all of their complexities mixed in.
Well, times in Mark, Jesus tells the disciples that some of them will still be around when the end times come.
Yeah.
How is
The
that
end
dealt
times.
with by other subsequent writers? You know, how it just didn't work out that way.
It didn't
And
happen,
so-
yeah, but Mark felt the end of time was imminent. In fact, I forget which community it was, but they stopped following all the rules and just lazed around eating grapes because they figured what matters
Right.
is coming like by dinner time. so-
Right.
And it
Well,
didn't
people still
happen.
talk about the end of times.
Mhm, mhm.
Everybody's predicting.
Right.
Remember those people that laid on their beds and were taken up to heaven? Remember they all committed suicide, out somewhere out west,
Oh, yeah.
and they thought, someone, a spaceship was gonna take them
Yeah,
away.
they've been
I mean,
going forever.
yeah,
I know. Literalism is, we need a t-shirt, literalism kills. Well, any other thoughts? You have great questions and you sound like such scholars.
no.
Oh, Mark. Oh, I love it. Well, shall I let you go? And you can have an early lunch and get to your reading. I sent you an email this morning with the reading for the week because I kind of forgot last week to send it to you in time. And Kate will get the slides to you shortly.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Thank you very